Welcome aboard the dark waters of the TheNiteKrew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The TheNiteKrew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained. Hi everyone, welcome back to The TheNiteKrew. We are on episode 12. Today's episode is one of the darkest and most disturbing cases in American true crime history. We're diving deep into the life and crimes of Albert Fish, a man whose acts were so horrific they still shock and haunt people nearly a century later. I feel like not a lot of people know about this one. More people know about Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, the popular ones. This one is very gruesome though. So I do want to warn you up front, this story contains graphic details about child abuse, murder, and cannibalism. It's not easy to hear, but it's important to remember these stories to honor the victims and understand the depths of human darkness. So, if you're ready, let's get into the chilling story of Albert Fish. But before we dive into the story, I just wanted to go over the most common characteristics of serial killers. I think it's important to know before we get into it. So the first one, childhood abuse or trauma. This is when they have physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. And this is extremely common in their early lives for most serial killers. And there's neglect, instability, or loss of a parent that can contribute to deep psychological wounds. This trauma often warps their emotional development and ability to form healthy attachments. Another one is bedwetting, fire setting, and animal cruelty, the MacDonald triad. This controversial theory suggests these three behaviors in childhood are potential red flags for future violent tendencies. Many serial killers have histories that include at least one of these traits or actions. Then they have a lack of empathy or remorse. Many serial killers show little to no empathy for others. They often lack guilt and may even enjoy manipulating or hurting people, which in most cases, that's the cause. There's also, they have charming or manipulative personality or behavior. They often present as charismatic, intelligent, or likable, like Ted Bundy. This helps them lure victims and avoid suspicion. Then there's fantasies of power, control, and violence. Violent fantasies often start in childhood or adolescence. These fantasies grow more intense and elaborate over time until the killer feels compelled to act them out. Sexual deviancy. Many serial killers have unconventional or extreme sexual interests. Some blur the lines between sex and violence. There's sadism, necrophilia, cannibalism, etc., which really two of those come into play in this story. And there's compulsion or ritualistic behavior. So many serial killers develop rituals they repeat with each murder. For example, like posing a body, using the same weapon, etc. They may also keep souvenirs or trophies from victims. They have a desire for control or a God complex. Serial killers often feel powerless in life and kill to gain that control back. They may feel like they have unlimited power, playing God with their victims' lives, essentially. Isolation or social dysfunction. Many are loners, outsiders, or socially awkward, though not always. Just like John Wayne Gacy, he was a politician and he was very social in his life. Others may have double lives, appearing normal on the surface but hiding dark compulsions. Again, John Wayne Gacy. And one of the last ones is it escalates over time. So serial killers don't usually start by killing. Crimes often escalate from voyeurism, stalking, assault, or animal abuse. The murders themselves often become more brutal and confident over time. So back to the story of Albert Fish. So let's rewind. Way back to 1870, that's when Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C., under the name Hamilton Howard Fish. Now, right off the bat, this guy did not stand a chance in society. His upbringing reads like a checklist of red flags and not the kind we throw around casually. I'm talking deep psychological warning signs that, looking back now, we've seen time and time again in serial killer profiles. Fish was born into a family full of mental illness and instability. One of his uncles was committed to an asylum. His brother was diagnosed with what we now call bipolar disorder. And his sister had severe mental health issues, and then his own mother experienced vivid hallucinations. So right there, we've got genetic predisposition, something that shows up in a lot of serial killers. And then comes the trauma. When Fish was just 5 years old, his father, who was 75 when Albert was born, died suddenly of a heart attack. His mother, with no money and multiple children, placed him into St. John's Orphanage, a place that was supposed to help him, but ended up doing the exact opposite. At the orphanage, Fish was physically beaten and abused regularly, but here's where it starts to turn disturbing, and sadly, this is a pattern we see in many serial killers. The constant abuse didn't just damage him, he started to like it. Fish would later say that those early beatings awakened something in him, a connection between pain and pleasure, which would become a massive part of his future crimes. This kind of early sexual deviance tied to trauma is another big trait we see in violent offenders. And if you're familiar with the old theory called the McDonald triad, like I mentioned earlier, Fish already hits 2 out of the 3. He was cruel to animals, reportedly killing and mutilating them as a child. He was obsessed with fire and reportedly lit small fires. And the third part of the triad is chronic bedwetting, which people can't confirm, but it's kind of speculated that he did that as well. He's already meeting all the characteristics for a serial killer, so why not? Now, once he left the orphanage, and again, only because his mother finally got a job and could care for him, he wasn't any better. He was broken, and the damage had already settled deep into his psyche. By his teens, Fish was experimenting with some deeply disturbing behavior. He was drinking urine, eating feces. Yes, you heard that right. And he started going to public bathhouses very often to watch young boys undress. Now, he didn't act on anything yet, but these were all of his dark, disgusting fantasies that he was having before his first kill. And that's another hallmark of serial killers. Violent and deviant fantasies that start in adolescence. They often fantasize for years before ever committing a crime. And when they finally do act, those fantasies drive them. They're basically reenacting their inner world, their inner thoughts. So during this point, Fish also began self-harming. He would stick needles into his groin and thighs, and later down the road, x-rays would show that some of those needles were still in his body, embedded deep under his skin decades later, and we're talking like 20 to 30 needles. Don't know how he did that or handled that. Ugh. This speaks to both his sadism, hurting others, and his masochism, hurting himself. It's rare for serial killers to be both, but Fish was. He didn't just enjoy causing pain. He needed it physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Pain was something that he could get off on, essentially. Later on, he changed his name from Hamilton to Albert, supposedly after a dead sibling, It started corresponding with men through personal ads in newspapers. What started as flirtation often became twisted role play, with Fish inserting violence and domination into letters with strangers. So, to kind of recap, just in these early years alone, Fish checks almost every box in the serial killer profile. We have childhood abuse, traumatic loss, sexual deviance, animal cruelty, violent fantasies, obsession with control and pain, and an utter lack of empathy. And he hadn't even killed anyone yet, but it was only a matter of time. So now I'll discuss the methods he used and the crimes that occurred. So now we're going to look at Albert Fish's deeply disturbing childhood. Let's talk about what he became and how those early scars turned into something monstrous. By the time Fish was in his 50s and 60s, which, by the way, is way older than most serial killers when they begin, he had developed a very specific procedure, which was clear and incredibly predatory. He targeted the most vulnerable victims, young children, usually between the ages of 4 and 10. He targeted both boys and girls, though he seemed to prefer boys. And his victims were often poor, unsupervised, or from struggling families. In other words, all of them were very easy to manipulate. Fish would often pose as someone helpless or harmless, a job seeker, a concerned neighbor, or a wealthy man. He had this quiet, grandfatherly appearance which made people let their guard down. And remember, this was the early 1900s. People weren't exactly thinking about stranger danger the way we do now. One of the most disturbing examples of this was the case of Grace Budd, his most well-known victim. Grace Budd's case is the emotional and psychological centerpiece of the Albert Fish story. This is the part of the story that stays with people. It's the part that broke a family and eventually cracked the mask Albert Fish had been hiding for so long. It was May 25th, 1928, when Albert Fish answered a simple classified ad placed by a working-class family in Manhattan. The Budds were a humble household, life was tough, money was tight, and they were just trying to get their teenage son, Edward, a shot at honest work. The ad read something like, "Young man, 18 years old, wishes position that's in the country." Albert Fish responded, not as Albert Fish, of course, but as Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer from Farmingdale, New York. He told them he was looking for someone to help with chores on his estate. He came to their home dressed like a gentleman, gray mustache, soft voice, neatly dressed. He even brought a small basket of food as a gesture of goodwill. Now picture this. He's sitting there in the Budds' modest living room, chatting casually with the parents, complimenting the family's manners and decency. He talks about his 6 children and his wife, which were all lies. He had none of that. And he said he wanted Edward, their son, to come work for him. But then something changes. He sees Grace, Edward's little sister. She was just 10 years old. She was bright, soft-spoken, and trusting. So she came into the room to see who the visitor was, and at that moment, Fish instantly changed his plan. Edward was no longer the target. So Fish spent the next few minutes rewriting the story in his head, creating a new excuse to take Grace instead of Edward. He tells the Budds that his niece is having a birthday party that afternoon, and that he would love to bring Grace along with him. He makes it sound like an honor that she would go with him, a fun treat. He promises she'll be back by evening, which I would not trust a random stranger with my child, but these were different times back then. So, the Budds, the parents, thinking this quiet old man is a kind family friend, they agreed. So they dressed Grace in her best white dress, they braided her hair, and sent her out the door, completely unaware that they were handing her over to a predator. Grace was never seen alive again. Obviously, Fish didn't take her to a party. He took her to an abandoned house he'd been renting in Wisteria Cottage in Westchester County, a place where no one would hear anything. He had planned this for a long time. What happened inside those walls is beyond horrific, and I'm not gonna go into every graphic detail here because it's just horrible what he did to his victims, and you don't need to hear them to feel the weight of what he did. But what's important to understand is that Fish's sadism, cannibalism, and obsession with control all played out in that house. After killing Grace, he reportedly cut her body into pieces and consumed her flesh over the course of several days. And then 6 years later, he sent a letter to the Budd family. Let that sink in. It's been 6 years after their daughter vanished without a trace, and her grieving parents receive a letter from the man who took her. And it wasn't just any letter, it was chilling, cold, and detailed. It started politely like a Victorian note, and then instantly it shifted into a nightmarish description. He recounted how he lured Grace, what he did to her, and in the most disturbing part, how he cooked and ate parts of her body. Now, this is something he did with all of his victims. He sent letters to everyone. But here's a short, redacted portion of that letter. And again, I want to caution listeners, this is disturbing. And this isn't even the whole of it. He said, "I brought her to the house. I had already picked out the place. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my room, cook, and eat it." He claimed he didn't sexually assault her, not out of mercy, but because in his twisted logic, her purity reminded him of his own childhood innocence. It's hard to know what's true and what's delusion in his writing, but that line, that claim only adds to the psychological horror. But Grace wasn't his only victim. Fish claimed to have killed at least 100 children, although only a handful of those murders have never been confirmed. What we do know is that he would lure children, kill them in horrific ways, and often write letters to their families, taunting them, describing what he'd done in vivid detail. In some cases, he even left behind newspaper clippings to show he'd been following the media coverage. His crimes were always about control, domination, and suffering, both for the victims and their families. He wanted everyone to suffer, essentially. He wanted to take pride in all these killings that he was doing to these poor kids. And this is where we see more of those common serial killer traits emerge. The ritualistic behavior. Fish repeated certain actions with every crime: the luring, the letters, the mutilation. Also, the need to relive the crime. He kept trophies in the form of memories, drawings, and disturbing writings. And of course, the escalation. His violence became more intense, his methods more sadistic, and his fantasies more unhinged as time went on. Fish even described stabbing children with his own homemade tools, things like paddles studded with nails. He inserted objects into his victims, he mutilated genitals, he even drank blood. It's almost unimaginable that a person could do this, and yet he walked among people for decades, quiet, unassuming, and unnoticed. So the big question is, how did he get away with this for so long? The answer is, he blended in. He didn't fit the mold of what people expected a predator to look like. He was old, he was polite, he wasn't physically intimidating, he used manipulation, not brute force, to get what he wanted. And that's another chilling hallmark of many serial killers. They're not monsters in the traditional sense. They often look just like anybody else. It's what's hidden underneath that makes them so dangerous. So now we're in 1934, and Grace Budd has been missing for 6 years. The Budd family had lived with the agony of not knowing what happened to her or who took her. There was no clues, no suspects, just silence. And then that letter arrived, the one that changed everything. So let's break down how that one piece of twisted correspondence brought the monster to light. Albert Fish, for all his evil, made one crucial mistake. He wanted the Budds to know. He needed them to feel it. He didn't just take Grace and disappear in the shadows. He circled back to them. He essentially inserted himself into their suffering. That letter was his ego talking, and that's what got him caught. Now, the envelope he used had a distinctive letterhead on it, something like a logo from a charitable organization called the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. That was the break investigators had been hoping for. Detectives traced the stationery back to a boarding house in Manhattan. Fish hadn't lived there, but he had visited someone who did and had taken some of their writing materials. Classic Fish, sneaky, manipulative. The landlady of that boarding house remembered him. She said he gave his name as Albert Fish and described him perfectly: quiet, gray-haired, odd, old, and polite. So now detectives had a name, a description, and a pattern. They didn't wait very long to find him. They staked out the boarding house, waiting for Fish to return. And sure enough, on December 13th, 1934, he showed up to collect a check, completely unaware he was walking into a trap. They approached him calmly. They asked who he was, and Albert, he didn't run, and he didn't deny it. All he said was, "That's it." And what followed next is what truly chills me. Once they had him in custody, he confessed immediately, but not just to Grace Budd's murder. He started talking about others, children whose names were never in the news, murders that had never been solved. He was calm, even cheerful, as he described what he had done. How he lured boys to vacant buildings, tortured them, killed them, and sometimes cooked their body parts. He told police about Francis McDonald, an 8-year-old boy whose body was found hanging from a tree in 1924, earlier that year, before he was arrested. And the little boy was beaten, strangled, and mutilated. Witnesses at the time described seeing an odd, gray-haired man wandering near the scene. It matched Fish perfectly. Then there was Billy Gaffney, a 4-year-old who vanished in 1927. Fish claimed he took the body to his home, tortured him with a whip, drank his blood, and later cooked pieces of his body into a stew. The level of detail he provided was sickening, but it was also very specific. Too specific to be a fantasy. He even sent another letter, this time to investigators, about Billy Gaffney. And again, I won't read the whole thing here, it's that bad. But let me just say, it involved boiling flesh, cooking internal organs, and describing how he enjoyed the cheeks, nose, and belly. At this point, detectives knew they weren't dealing with any typical criminal. They were dealing with someone whose entire psychology was built on control, pain, and ritualistic violence. And what struck the detectives wasn't just the confession, it was how casual Fish was about all of it. He had no emotion, no remorse, just vivid recollections, almost like he was reading from a grocery list. When they asked him why he did it, he gave all kinds of answers. That God told him to do it, he wanted to suffer, he wanted to cleanse children, and even he believed pain brought him closer to divinity. It was a storm of madness, religion, delusions, and evil, all wrapped in this frail old man's body. Fish was eventually charged with Grace Budd's murder, since it was the one case with enough concrete evidence to prosecute. And honestly, it didn't take long. The letter alone was more than enough evidence for them. But behind the scenes, investigators continued piecing together a fuller picture of the man they just unmasked. They discovered his apartment filled with bizarre drawings, cannibal cookbooks, and self-made torture instruments, including a paddle studded with nails that he claimed to use on himself and his victims. And as I mentioned earlier, even his x-rays became a part of that horror. Doctors found 29 needles embedded in his groin and abdomen. He had inserted them into his body over the years and just left them there. It was clear Albert Fish wasn't just a killer. He was in a category all his own, a living nightmare. And as the investigation concluded, all that was left was a trial, and the question, was this man insane or evil? And we'll talk about that and how the court tried to answer it in the next part of this story. So the mind of Albert Fish. When you hear what Albert Fish did, the first instinct is to say this man has to be insane or had to be insane. You're not wrong, but the reality is a little more complicated than that. After his arrest, Fish became the center of a heated debate between psychiatrists, detectives, and the court system. Was he legally insane, meaning he didn't know right from wrong, or was he a calculated sadist who simply enjoyed killing? Let's start with what we know. Fish had a long history of bizarre and self-destructive behavior that pointed to some serious mental illness. For starters, he heard voices, which he claimed were from God, telling him to harm children. He experienced vivid religious delusions, believing he was chosen to atone for his sins by suffering and to cleanse children through pain. And he engaged in extreme masochism, inserting needles into his body, hitting himself with spike paddles. And this part's disgusting, but he would push wool soaked in lighter fluid into his anus and set it on fire. He was really into pain for him and his victims. To a psychiatrist, these are massive red flags for psychosis, specifically schizoaffective disorder or just other horrible disorders. But here's the twist. Despite these bizarre compulsions, Fish could also be incredibly calculated. He knew how to hide his crimes, he used fake names, he carefully picked isolated locations, and he lied smoothly to gain trust. That's not someone completely detached from reality, that's someone who knows the rules and knows how to break them without getting caught. Psychiatrists who evaluated him described him as a combination of a sadist, someone who gets pleasure from inflicting pain on others. Masochist, someone who gets pleasure from receiving pain. Cannibal, with a sexual component tied to consuming human flesh. And psychotic, with hallucinations and religious delusions. It's rare to see all these traits in one person. Usually, serial killers fall into one category, not multiple. But it seemed like Fish ticked every disturbing box. One doctor at the time described him as the most insane person he ever examined, who was also completely aware of his actions. And that's the legal key here. Under the law, insane doesn't mean mentally ill. It means you cannot understand right from wrong at the time of the crime. But Fish did understand, at least enough to know he had to hide bodies, lie to police, and even use fake names. Another point prosecutors made, if he truly believed killing children was a divine mission, why hide the evidence? Why use fake names? Why run when people got suspicious? The defense, of course, argued the opposite, that his hallucinations, compulsions, and lifelong mental illness meant he wasn't in control. But honestly, listening to his own words tells you everything you need to know. When asked why he sent the Budd family that letter, he said, "I had the desire to tell them the truth, the real truth. Not because I felt bad, but because I wanted them to know what I had done." Now that's not remorse, that's ownership and pride that he was speaking of. And when he described killing children, he did so with a calm, almost casual tone. He remembered dates, times, and even small details about the weather or what they were wearing. That's not psychotic disorganization, that's just meticulous memory. In modern criminal profiling terms, Albert Fish would be classified as a mixed-type serial killer. He had organized traits, careful planning, luring victims, controlling the crime scene. He had disorganized traits, like extreme brutality, random victims, and chaotic self-harm. Now that mix is extremely rare, and it's what made him so unpredictable. At the end of the day, most experts agree he was suffering from severe mental illness, but he was also fully aware of what he was doing and enjoyed every part of it. And that's the truly terrifying part. Insanity can sometimes protect you from moral responsibility, but Fish, he walked the razor's edge between madness and method, which meant, in the eyes of the law, that there was only one outcome. By the time Albert Fish stood trial in March of 1935, the courtroom was already packed. Journalists, spectators, even curious locals who had read about the so-called Gray Man in the papers. And it wasn't just morbid curiosity. People were genuinely trying to wrap their heads around what this frail, elderly man was accused of. Because that's what made it so surreal. Fish didn't look like a monster. He was small, polite, gray-haired, soft-spoken. If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was someone's grandfather. But the evidence, the confessions, the letter, they all told a very different story. The state's case was straightforward. They had the letter to the Budd family traced directly back to him. They had his own confession to killing Grace Budd. And they had corroborating details from other murders that matched unsolved cases. They didn't need to prove he'd killed all the children he claimed. They only needed to prove one, Grace Budd. The prosecution leaned heavily on the fact that Fish had planned the crime. He used a fake name, he told multiple lies to gain the Budds' trust, and he even rented the house ahead of time, ensuring no one would interrupt him. This wasn't some random act of violence, it was calculated. And that meant legally he knew what he was doing. The defense, on the other hand, built their case entirely around insanity. The psychiatrists were on the stand, and they described Fish's lifelong mental illness of his hallucinations, his religious delusions, compulsive self-behavior, and just his gruesome, horrible mentality. One psychiatrist even testified that Fish's sexual fetishes were so extreme they had never seen anything like it in their entire careers. They argued that no sane person would commit such acts, that his crimes weren't motivated by malice, but by a mind so warped and broken that reality didn't apply. And it's true, by any measure, Fish was deeply disturbed, but the prosecution countered with a key point. Mental illness is not the same as legal insanity. One moment that really gripped the courtroom was when the prosecution read the Grace Budd letter aloud. Even in the age before television, this was a public spectacle, and the details were so graphic that several jurors looked away. But it had the intended effect. It painted Fish not as someone out of touch with reality, but as someone who relishes it, someone who wanted his crimes remembered. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. When they came back, the verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. And then came the sentence, death by electric chair. Now here's something eerie. When Erie heard his sentence, he didn't beg, he didn't cry, he actually seemed relieved with the verdict. Some reports say he even smiled. He supposedly told reporters later that execution would be the supreme thrill of his life. That tells you everything you need to know about the mind of Albert Fish. In January of 1936, Albert Fish was taken to Sing Sing prison to await his execution, and just before his death, he gave one final statement, though no one will ever know what it was. Witnesses say he spoke a few words to the guards, but they refused to repeat them, calling them obscene. At 11:06 p.m. on January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was strapped into the electric chair. The execution took 2 jolts to kill him, likely because of the metal needles embedded in his pelvis, which may have interfered with the current. And with that, the life of one of America's most depraved killers came to an end. But his story, his crimes, the horror he left behind, that still lingers. Because the truth is, Albert Fish isn't remembered for how he died. He's remembered for how he lived, and what that says about the darkest corners of human nature. When we talk about people like Albert Fish, it's easy to get caught up in the details of their crimes. The shock, the depravity, the morbid curiosity. But the truth is, if we end the story there, we let the killers have the last word. Grace Budd's name needs to be the only person to remember. She was a daughter, a sister, a little girl who loved her family and trusted a stranger because she had no reason not to. The Budds lived the rest of their lives with the weight of what happened. They had to walk past the room Grace once played in. They had to open their mailbox knowing it had once held a letter from the man who stole her from them. And yet, they still found the strength to sit in that courtroom and look him in the eyes. Albert Fish wanted control. He wanted to decide who lived and who died, who suffered and who didn't. But in the end, he didn't get that. The law took that control away from him. And no matter how he tried to twist it, his death was not some grand final thrill. It was the last act in a life defined by cruelty. Cases like this remind us of 2 things. First, evil doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It doesn't always wear a mask of rage or menace. Sometimes it smiles politely and offers to take your child to a birthday party. And second, every statistic, every headline, every name in a true crime story was a real person. Someone who deserved a life that wasn't stolen from them. So tonight, as we close this chapter, remember Grace Budd and the other victims. Grace Budd we don't want to remember her as a victim of Albert Fish, but as a little girl who deserved to grow up and live life. And remember the countless other children whose names we'll never know, whose stories ended before they began. So, with that being said, thank you for listening to this episode of The Night Crew. If you found this story important or if it moved you in any way, I encourage you to share it, not for the sake of the killer, but for the victims. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and take care of one another.